Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Parenting as a Black Feminist, the origins of Black feminism. It's been quite some time, so I'm really thankful that you've taken time out of your day to sit down with me and continue your learning and development as a parent and as a budding Black feminist. If you recall, my name is Mo Ashe Biomo. I use she, her pronouns, and I teach classes in Black feminism, and a lot of my research in college was really around race and identity, especially for children, especially within the realm of developmental psychology. So I was really excited for this session, our April session, to really dive into some of the things I spent most of my research and writing in college around. So thank you for joining us. I invite you to go ahead and steady yourself, find somewhere comfortable to listen, or if you're on the go, wherever you may be listening, just take a moment to center yourself or situate yourself. So I wanted to start off with going over today's agenda. So we have, actually, let me stop sharing for one moment because I'm a little too far on that slide. All right, here, let me resume sharing. Alrighty, thank you for bearing with me as I make sure the slides are correct. So welcome back. Thank you for being here. So for today's plan, we're going to have a quick meditation. Then we're going to recap on some of the things that we covered in our previous session. And then today we're talking all about children and race. So children and their racial identities, how they conceptualize race, and how that ties back to their cognitive frameworks, which is all a nice way of saying, how do kids understand race, and how can we as parents, as educators, as adults, begin to show up for our children and for other children in the ways that they need to in order to kind of build a healthy understanding and mindset of race and identity. So we'll take a quick stock of our current landscape. So what's happening now, what are parents telling their kids now, how are families operating? And then secondly, looking at cognitive frameworks, which just means how do children actually think? We may not, I certainly do not remember how my mind thought at the ages of 2, 5, 7, 10 years old. But luckily we have a lot of developmental psychologists who spend their life in this realm, really using language to explain how it is that children understand the world, how they see it, and how that then translates to their behavior. And then lastly, we'll end on a video and some of my own guiding principles of where do we go from here in terms of talking about race with our children and other children. So with all that being said, we're going to start off with a short meditation. And so I have this horizon, a very beautiful image. And I invite you to take a moment, if you're able to lower your gaze or close your eyes. I'm going to say some statements, and I just want you to fill in the blank. And don't fight whatever is coming up. Just whatever you feel is right. So there's not one right or wrong way to do this. So my first statement that I want you to fill in is, I'm confident in my ability to parent, especially parent a Black family or Black child, because of. So I'll say that one more time. I am confident in my ability to parent a Black family or a Black child because maybe you're thinking of experiences that you've had tied to your Blackness or tied to race. Or you're thinking about things that you sought out in your learning or your skill building, If you had to name one thing or kind of a broad category of things, what gives you confidence in your ability to parent, and especially parenting as a Black parent or parenting to a Black child? All right. My second statement that I invite you to fill in is, I want to take you back to a time when you were younger and you were around this age that I mentioned of 7 to 10 or 3 to 7. I want you to answer this. The first time I became aware of my own race as a young child was when? So think back for yourselves. When was that first occasion or experience or a time that you can really recall being made aware of your race or the race of others? Perhaps it's not as clear cut or definite. Maybe it's a little more blurry. This is way back in the past. Or maybe it is shockingly clear. So just think back. The first time I became aware of my own race as a young child was when? Yeah, for this statement, I'm thinking about when I was in second grade. This was really the first time that I become aware of the fact that I was a Black child. And one of my roommates, excuse me, not roommates, one of my classmates had said something very degrading to me, because we had talked about slavery previously in the day. And this white child, Brooklyn, told me something it was very crude. It was something along the lines of, you're like Black like a cockroach or something, or you're brown like a cockroach. And I still remember that. And that was years ago. That was like very like 20 something years ago. So, and I remember that with really great clarity. So sometimes these experiences stick with us. And then sometimes it's just, there have been so many experiences and so many touch points of becoming aware of our identity, and of our Blackness, our racial identity, that there's really not one that sticks out among others. All right, so we're almost done here. We have 2 more statements. The third statement is, I want my child to love and appreciate their racial identity because. So I want my child to love and appreciate their racial identity because. So this might be a very obvious answer to you. You're like, obviously, because I want them to be confident in themselves. I want them to be aware of the world that they live in, or I want them to be safe. So even though this is kind of it may feel like a very obvious question, obvious statement, it is. I think there's power to putting words behind it. Is it? And there's probably a multitude of things, but if you had to choose one, it's about raising children who are really confident in themselves. Raising children who are self-aware, children who are empathetic. Yeah, just take a moment. And now lastly, this is my last kind of statement or question for all of you, is if you could go back in time. So if you could go back in time to when you were a child and you were around 7 to 10 or 3 to 7 years old, what is one thing you wish an adult had told you, or an adult had shared with you, or an experience you could have had with an adult? What's one thing that you can think of that? And ideally, it has to do with your identity and conversations of race. But what is one thing? And maybe you don't. It's not something you wish. Maybe it was something that actually happened. what was that one thing that a adult or parent or educator they told you that made a really positive impact? Right. Okay. So as we go throughout the lesson today, I really want this to be what we're coming back to, right? We're coming back to these questions and the sentiment behind these questions of what do I want to instill on the child, not just my own child, but like this younger generation. What is it that I want to instill on them that I wish I had, or that I did have that made a really positive impact? And also a question of like going back to that time, what was it like when you became aware of this sense of your identity and your racial, specifically your racial identity, right? Tapping back into that and realizing, there's a lot that comes up with that. And so being patient, not only with yourself and your journey of talking to children and the younger generation, but also with the children themselves, because this is a very sensitive territory that we're going to be broaching. Awesome. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our lesson. So before we jump into this new content, I wanted to recap on some of the things that we had covered previously with the 5 stages of racial identity development. So if you recall, these stages these were put forth by William E. Cross, who really, he was a psychologist, if I recall, and a writer. And so he created these 5 stages of racial identity. Even though William E. Cross is a Black man who created these, and typically has these 5 stages of racial identity, has typically been linked to the Black experience. It could be applicable to other racial minorities, not necessarily white people, even though and we might touch on this later, there has been some attempts to like understand like how white people become aware of their whiteness, but know that it is generalizable, but it was created by a Black man with specific ties to the Black experience. Okay, all of that being said, these were the 5 stages that we discussed. There's the pre-encounter, the encounter, the immersion, internalization, commitment. And so for today's purposes, we're really just going to be focusing on this pre-encounter. As you can see, William Cross said it's psychology of negriance. And so it's based on the Black experience. But for today's purposes, we'll just be focused on the pre-encounter, right? So this is when the child begins to absorb messages about the minority group. And so this is typically also in the pre-operational stage, which is what's next that we'll cover, but this is really like just the beginning of this racial identity development. Oh, I forgot I included this, but this is Stephen O. Roberts. He was my advisor, and he was my advisor in psychology at Stanford, where I studied. And so he was really where he was. What I'm trying to say is that he was very instrumental in me creating building my understanding and knowledge of this topic area, which I went on to do research and writing for throughout my undergrad. And so I just wanted to include him as as someone who really helped cultivate. I met him my second year in college, and he really just pushed me on this path to exploring cognition and children and race. Those 3 things: children, cognition, and race. And cognition is like the way that we think, or the way that children think. And so that's kind of what's brought me here to all of you. So I wanted to include him in some of the work that he does. So there's my shout out to Professor Roberts. Yeah, so going back to the pre-encounter, right? So we're looking at the pre-encounter, and we're also looking at this developmental stage of the pre-operational. So this is 2 to 6 or 7. And also it kind of begins to creep into concrete operational. But this is really the age demographic that we'll be honing in on, or that we are honing in on. And while you might see things that can be applicable to other age groups, or even you at your own age, this is really where I'll be kind of starting from. Right. So we're looking at pre-operational. This is when a child is beginning to represent the world symbolically. So this is absolutely huge. You have a child who was before very dependent on adults of understanding the world around them. They didn't necessarily have this kind of infrastructure to begin to think on their own. And now we're really seeing them come into themselves and have, the foundation of their thought. It's a critical time. Neurologists will tell you, like, this is a really critical time in a lifespan, because this is when you are most vulnerable to trauma, and you're most vulnerable to things that can impact the neuroplasticity of the brain, because the brain is very malleable, and even more so at this age, pre-operational stage to the concrete operational stage. All right. So let's take stock of our current landscape. So how are people talking to children about race? And for here, I'll just stop sharing the screen for a minute so I can talk one-on-one. So we have this this is what really got me excited to go into research around this, but we have a very specific idea about children and race. We often conceive as children as very innocent, and I'm talking about like 3 to 7 years old. They're very innocent. They don't understand the world, and you don't want to, parents or educators and adults, they don't want to corrupt these kids with talking about race, because they don't want them to feel as though, I've made this child now aware of these social constructs that will then lead them to being less good, right? And so we hear a lot of phrases when kids start talking about race. We hear a lot of phrases like, everybody's equal, under the skin, we're all the same. It's not nice to talk about skin color. We don't talk about people. So I'm imagining a young child asking their parent, "Oh, why is that woman's skin that way?" Or why is my skin not look like another child's, what have you? And our instinct is to silence these kids, because you're like, oh my goodness, I don't want them to become aware of the differences. And it's really interesting, because as you'll see as we go on, the way that these kids' brains are wired are to notice the differences. And so we're having these very contrasting conversations where they're reaching an age where they're becoming more independent. They're beginning to understand the world and understand especially symbolism, right? And how this cup, for example, is symbolic of a cup rather than just an object, if that makes sense. We'll go more into that if that doesn't make sense, but they're really coming into their thinking. And then we have adults who are like, oh, race is completely off limits. We don't talk about race because it's seen as bad, or it's seen as not good. So that's where a lot of rhetoric about, we don't talk about race, let's be nice. We don't say things about people. That's where it comes from. And it all kind of comes together to create this color blindness. And so if you're not familiar with color blindness, it's what's used to describe this idea of not seeing color. And it's meant to be this moral high ground, right? Where it's like, I don't want my child to see race. I want them to see a person. I want them to see personality. I want them to see their character. And while it has the best of intentions, what it starts to teach children to do at this critical development is to not be able to speak on the things that make us different. I have a quote here from Kate Ingle, who I use a lot of her work. She's an early childhood educator and anti-racism consultant. And she says, She says, when we don't discuss race with kids, they will not just come to their own conclusions, they'll come to racist conclusions. Yes. And so, and the reason why they come to racist conclusions is because when there's an opportunity to kind of build something constructive, we silence them. We say, you know, don't say that. That's not nice. If you say, oh, that person's Black, you know, you feel as though we're going to silence them and they'll just come to their conclusions on their own. But what they're actually coming to conclusions on their own at that very early age is, okay, I'm noticing this difference and I'm being told not to talk about it. Typically, we don't talk about bad things, right? So this thing must be bad if I'm being told that we can't talk about it. And so you grow up in age and you reach this point where you're uncomfortable talking about race because at this early developmental stage, you were taught not to recognize it. And of course, this experience varies differently across different nationalities, different ethnicities, different racial groups. I know in a Black household, it is somewhat different, right? Where you don't really have this luxury to have your child come to their own conclusions on their own. And even though Black parents or educators may promote colorblindness to a point, there is a difference that we see between specifically like white children, where there's this conversation and series of conversations of race and Blackness. So I have another quote here from the book Why White Parents Don't Talk About Race. Their authors are Poe Bronson and Ashley Merriman. The authors say that parents assume that choosing not to discuss race will make their children extremely tolerant and colorblind by not pointing out obvious differences. So some takeaways here are shushing kids achieves nothing. Because when we shush children, we make them, their instinctive reflex is that something is wrong or something is bad. It only further cements this message of stigma or this message of silence around things that are critical to understanding race. Also, this is a good segue into these cognitive frameworks that I referred to, but especially at this pre-operational stage, children are not passive absorbers of knowledge, which just means as we age, our ability to be more active in our learning and passive in our learning fluctuates. But especially like at this young age, children are actively finding ways to understand their world. And so when we begin to distort the reality that we live in, children don't have this preconceived way of disentangling that. They understand it as it's being said, if that makes sense. So which is all just to emphasize and go back to this point that this is a critical stage, right? Where if we don't have these open conversations, and we don't shed light on the things that matter, we are just like perpetuating this misinformation. And in this case, it's not even misinformation, it's just silence. And so there's no magical day where a kid finally grows up and they're like, oh, I want to learn about racism. I want to learn about melanin. I want to learn about what makes this person different from this person. Because they're silenced at such a young age, they kind of have to do that self-discovery on their own. And so if they pick up these misconceived messages along the way, there's really no space to really grapple with it at all, because it's not something that we talk about openly. And so with all of that, I'm hoping we can go over some of these frameworks that I mentioned. So these key cognitive frameworks, so these are really describing the way that children think, right? And this is in the pre-operational stage, which is a nod to Piaget, because Piaget was the psychologist who constructed these stages. So we have transductive reasoning, we have stereotypes, we have essentialism. Let's start with transductive reasoning. So transductive reasoning, it's I'll read the definition and then I'll explain in my own words. So it's a tendency of a child in the pre-operational stage of cognitive development to see a connection between unrelated instances, using neither deductive nor inductive means to do so. For example, a child might say, I haven't had my nap, so it isn't afternoon. This makes no sense, right? So this is, once again, a nod to this growing sense of the world and understanding and reasoning, right? This is a new form of reasoning, transductive. It is very specific to the, as you can see in this definition, to a child in this stage of cognitive development, because we don't see this later on. As adults and uh, um, as people, as, excuse me, I shouldn't say as adults, but as those with more developed reasoning skills, we typically use deductive or inductive reasoning. So we can say, you know, I haven't had my nap yet, and it's because it isn't afternoon yet. But for children, it's almost like it's these connections that we can understand as being unrelated are suddenly integral to the identity of that. So it's integral to the identity of a nap being in the afternoon. So if this person had a nap in the morning, if this child had a nap in the morning, they would think that it's the afternoon. Or if it was the afternoon, they haven't. It can get kind of confusing, but just know that it's this tendency or it's this inclination to create connection between unrelated instances. Because there's not this complicated, we can't complicate our reasoning there. And so I'll go through all of these reasonings, and they all kind of build on each other. And then we can summarize how this could perhaps be a little detrimental to understanding race and identity, right? When this is the cognitive frameworks that we're working with. So we'll kind of summarize this after we go through all of them. Secondly, stereotypes. So stereotypes is very well known. It's widely held but fixed and overly simplified belief about things or people driven by schemas. And so schemas is something that we learn in psychology when humans are presented with large amounts of information, like a huge amount of information. The way our brain works is, in order to conserve in order to conserve the efficiency, instead of memorizing all of the things, all of the information that we're presented with, we form schemas, and they're like these short frameworks that help us understand the situation. So for example, instead of memorizing all of the things that can contribute to a car accident, so instead of memorizing that it's typically being on your phone, it's also bad weather, it's when you don't follow the sign, if you don't follow traffic signs, if you're talking on the phone, if you're listening to loud music, if I'm trying to think of all this. So I can't think of all the things that can contribute to a car accident. I know there are many, but instead of memorizing all of these, our brains might have the schema that, okay, car accidents typically happen when you're distracted. So that covers all of these internal things. Or if there's bad weather or circumstances. So now that covers snow, sleet, hail, icy roads, X, Y, and Z. And external circumstances could be like bad driving. So instead of, my brain has to store all of that information, I can create the schema that kind of blanket covers this narrative. So that's what gives birth to stereotypes. And then lastly, essentialism. So essentialism it's not necessarily just in children. A lot of us still use essentialist thinking, but it's kind of as the name suggests, it's that certain ways of categorizing people reflect meaningful fundamental distinctions found in nature. That's some kind of category or essence. So for children, when it's less nuanced, it's, if I see a bear digging a hole, that means all bears dig holes. And it's like, well, we know that's not true. But in order, as this mind develops, it's a very essentialist thinking. And it has a bit of transductive reasoning there as well. So it's not only, I guess transductive reasoning says If one bear does it, all bears do it. And essentialism says, and that has something specifically to do about bears. Like it's tied to being a bear. Like being a bear means also digging holes. Okay, so let me give another example in case that didn't hit home. Transductive reasoning says that if someone with curly hair, so this is a little more specific, this is more likely, if someone with curly hair, such as myself, so I have curly hair, if someone with curly hair has free or reduced lunch, all people with curly hair have free or reduced lunch. And not only that, that's just part of what it means to be a curly haired person, is that you have free or reduced lunch. And so yes, like even as I say that, I'm like, oh, that is you can get into some really tricky territory with that line of thought. So stop screen. That can get really tricky, right? Because then you're like, oh, no, because then you're just generalizing. Basically what you're doing is you're generalizing, right? But it's not out of a malicious intent. It's literally just how your brain is actually functioning at this time in childhood. And so what we see is, once again, this disconnect where we're telling children not to talk about race, we're shushing them, we're kind of seeking this color blindness. We put color blindness on a pedestal where we don't want kids to recognize race. And then at the same time, their cognitive structures as they're growing up and as they're developing lends themselves well to problematic ways of thinking. So I'll let that sit. And I had some books here that I read for my research in college and that I reference now. And so I can give a quick example before we go into what we can do to remedy this. But even Beverly Tatum talks about how another way that color blindness is really rewarded and affirmed. And she talks about a situation where a white father is in the car with a white child, and she's pointing out her friend Alicia. I forget the exact name, but let's say Alicia. And the dad had never met Alicia, so he doesn't know what Alicia looks like. And so this child is in the back of the car, and she's like, oh, that's my friend Alicia. That's my friend Alicia. And her dad's like, which one? Who's Alicia? And Alicia is black. But the child says, oh, it's the girl with the pink shirt and the purple backpack with glasses, and goes on to list a series of physical characteristics, with the exception of this girl being black, or this girl's racial identity. And the father's in the car, and he's able to note that, okay, that's Alicia and she's black, but my child didn't recognize that fact. And he feels very proud, right? Because he feels like, oh my goodness, my child doesn't see color. This child, other things are more important than this child being black. And this father goes home and feels pretty good about the way that he's raised his child. Whereas I see that situation, right? And Beverly Tatum also sees that situation and says, at such a young age, we've already taught this young person to notice everything but skin color, right? And so that can be harmful in a lot of ways. And so when we kind of use these big words of transductive reasoning and essentialism, stereotype, it's all to say that seeing difference is a byproduct of this stage in development. It's not only a byproduct, it's ingrained in this development. And so where there's an opportunity to begin to use that to our advantage, it's not really taken. But there's a lot of things that we can do. There's a lot of things that we can do to begin to remedy that. All of which I have here, and then I kind of dial it down and leave it on the presentation. The first thing that we can begin to do is notice that whiteness has become the default, and doing everything in our power as a parent or as an educator to destabilize that, right? And so constantly reminding our children that whiteness is not the default, whether that's through representation in media, whether that's through representation in books, or Well, that's through like directly having conversations about how whiteness isn't the norm, especially in different countries and in different cultures and different livelihoods. It's very tied to the US and Eurocentrism that whiteness is the norm. It actually has become quite global, so I don't even know if that's completely true. I have an excerpt here that I wanted to read that Tatum writes. Children can learn to question whether demeaning or derogatory depictions of other people are stereotypes. And when reading books or watching television, they can learn to ask who is doing what in the storyline and why. Who is in the role of leader and who is taking the orders? Who or what is the problem and who is solving it, and who has been left out in the story altogether? Not only do children need to be able to recognize distorted representations, they also need to know what can be done about them. Learning to recognize cultural and institutional racism and other forms of inequity without also learning strategies to respond to them is a prescription for despair. Yet even preschool children are not too young to begin to think about what can be done about unfairness. And so this is one of the takeaways that Beverly mentions and that I talk about in the final slide, is that we don't have to have these huge conversations with our young children about inequity and racism and racist and systems of oppression. We can start with something much more tangible, like unfairness, and having our values and of our household be then connected back to like anti-racism work. And so that's kind of what Dr. Tatum talks about here. Such and such, such and such, such and such. For children to feel good and confident about themselves, they need to be able to say, that's not fair, or I don't like that, if they are the target of prejudice or discrimination. For children to develop empathy and respect for diversity, they need to be able to say, I don't like what you are doing, to a child who's abusing another child. We teach children, If we teach children to recognize injustice, then we must also teach them that people can create positive change by working together. Through activism activities, children build the confidence and skills for becoming adults who assert in the face of injustice. I have the responsibility to deal with it. I know how to deal with it. I will deal with it. So all to say, I know that was kind of a lot, or that was a lot of reading, but all to say that it starts with value signaling, right? So in this household, we are X. In this household, we are Y. In this household, we are, what have you, and then be connected, and then have those values signaling be connected to race, right? And even talking about race is kind of an act of liberation in of itself, especially when we see that the norm is to shush children when they ask questions about race, or to kind of use these kind of banal phrases to distract them from having real conversations, like, oh, we're all the same underneath, we're all equal in God's eyes, which you can obviously say, but it's a matter of what is also being said. So if a child says, no, mommy, why does that person look dirty? It's like, no, sitting that child down and say, no, that child isn't dirty. They have a different skin color. And that's because of the melanin in their skin. And that's what makes them darker, but it's not that they're dirty. And so really having these honest conversations, rather than like listening to our kind of instinct of like, oh, don't say that. That's not good. Yeah. We don't talk about that. Be nice. We're all the same. And so I really want to recognize that Black parents especially are already doing a lot of this work. And as we know, it's not just one conversation. It's not the talk or like one does it all. It's really a intuitive practice that happens over like years and years, and seeing opportunities and taking them, whether that's like, when you're watching a movie and you're saying, oh, look, do you notice like who the princess is? Oh, the princess is white. Just know that princesses can be any skin color, not just white, because going back to that transductive reasoning, for a child, that might signal, oh, this princess is white, all princesses are white. And then one day your child is saying, I want to be white. You find out, you push a little more, and they are actually saying they want to be a princess. But they didn't know that princess, you don't have to be white to be a princess, right? And so even when children begin to express discomfort or this almost, it sounds like internalized racism or internalized hatred for their own race, I encourage you to push a little further, because oftentimes, because of the way that they're understanding the world, it's not as malicious as we might think, where our instinct is to say, no, you should be proud of who you are. You should be proud of your heritage. Don't say those things, because and it is kind of silencing them by the same token, right? So what I really want you all to walk away with is that understanding how children's brains work should help us to then disseminate the information back to them in a way that feels honest. So you're not making things up. Like, talking about melanin is not fake. You're not like, you're telling the truth, and you're probing a little further to know, where is this coming from? So I say all of that, and I wanted to end with some of the things that I do in my own classes, and then a short video. I'll show this video after these slides, but I teach pre-K and kindergarten, and in one of our most recent classes, we had this game called Can You Spot the Difference? And obviously, you'll be surprised. This kind of threw off a lot of kids. It's supposed to be the banana. And so we played this game, and these are really young kids. These are like 4 to, actually, most of them were like 6. These are 6 to 7, like 6 and 7 year olds, or like 5 to 7 year olds. They were like, this was mostly kindergarten, not pre-K. And so we played this game that I created. It was in honor of Black History Month, and then I kind of kept it because it every month is Black History Month. And so I just asked the kids to like put what number category they think is different. So we start off really easy with fruit. We start off easy with fruit, and then I misorganize it. We do fruit, and then we do animals. This one is like the cheetah is the one that's different, because all of these are sea animals. This is a land animal. And then we do something even more basic, like which one of these are different, and it's these planes and jets and helicopters, and then you have the car, and the car is the one that's different. And we eventually build up to this image, which is 3 Black children and one white child, and it's like, can you spot the difference? And the kids always spot the difference. They know, they see skin color, they see what makes us different. They just have been conditioned by adults to not say anything. So I know for a fact in these classrooms, they're like category 3. They're not like, we're all the same, so I cannot tell you which one is different. And so when we do this exercise, it's mostly accompanied by celebration. After each one, I talk about how we raise our hand, like whose favorite fruit is apple, or whose favorite fruit is raspberry. And then we're like, whose favorite animal is a whale? Whose favorite animal is a cheetah? Who's been in an airplane? Who's been in a car? So we're celebrating every step of the way, so that even when we get to people, it's still a celebration, right? And so this is the beginning of rewiring our minds to like not associating spotting differences as negative or as offensive. And so after all these sessions we usually have a dance party where I play some kind of silly music, and we're all just dancing and having a good time. And my hope for them is to leave with the sense of, when I see something that's different, it's not a bad thing. When I group people into categories, that's not a bad thing. It only becomes a bad thing when we have messages and adults that tell us, these groups are X, Y, and Z, when we have those stereotypes come up. But we can't even begin to address those stereotypes if we're not even talking about the thinking that gives way to stereotypes in the first place. And so some guiding principles that I want to revisit and re-emphasize is, starting at the bottom here, link back to the values of the household. If the values of the household are treating everyone with respect, that means saying, it does for in this household, if your friend is Black, if your friend is white, if your friend is brown, if your friend looks like Sophia, or if your friend looks like Anita, if your friend looks like Teresa, if your friend looks like Sasha, what have you, what matters is that we're treating them fairly. And so I don't mean to say like, oh, it doesn't matter if you're Black, brown, or blue. I don't know why that's a common phrase when there aren't blue people or there aren't purple people. You can say that, but let's going back to that honesty portion, that truth portion, let's actually use races that exist. But we're talking to kids about that because that's really confusing. I feel like I would be really confused as a kid if you're like, oh, I don't care if this person is purple, yellow, blue, green, or orange, but you don't see any purple, green, blue, or orange people. Secondly, to reemphasize is to keep the conversation going. It's not a one and done type deal where you have this large conversation and then that's it. These are conversations that are happening time after time, where you see opportunity in the grocery store, when watching a movie, in the car, on the walk, in the park, as much as you can, to not signal that noticing someone's skin color is bad. And then challenging any reasoning that starts to come up that's like, oh, I thought all Black people did this. I thought all white people were doctors, or I thought all people with curly hair get free or reduced lunch. Thirdly, don't overwhelm with large amounts of information. And you don't have to have all the answers, right? So I'm by no means expecting you to go full lecture mode like I've done with you all today. When you're talking to your children or your child. And you can also do what's well within your capacity. If it's been a long day and you're already feeling that capacity of your own to talk about race diminishing, also take care of yourself and don't put yourself, and I'm not necessarily encouraging you all to like resist your comfort zone in terms of having conversations beyond your capacity. And then lastly, ask questions. Ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. Going back to the example of a child saying, I want to be white, and then you find out like, oh, it's my child wants to be a princess, but they think all princesses are white. Ask questions as much as you can to gain context before you even begin to share information. You can say, what happened? What happened to make you ask that? Or, what makes you say that? Why do you think that is? There's not a perfect formula, but I always recommend asking. In everything that I do, I try to ask more questions than give answers, because more often at the time, the questions will help us lead to like what our answers need to be. All right, so with that, I just wanted to show this video that I thought was a nice kind of recap of everything that we've discussed today, and also offer some resources. Alrighty.
Race is one of those touchy subjects you don't really want to get into because you're afraid you might mess up. But the fact is that as early as 3 years old, children are classifying people based on their appearances. And so the worst conversation adults can have with kids about race is no conversation at all. Talking to kids about race needs to happen early, often, and honestly. Saying honestly, yeah, people are different, cultures are different, but that's a good thing. How boring would it be to have a crayon box that all had the same color? There are so many ways to approach racial conversations. You can use Dr. Seuss books, you can use any sort of pop culture reference. There are many, many movies, animated movies especially, that form a good entryway. So it's helpful, especially as a parent, to watch the movie beforehand maybe, or read a plot summary and say, well, what's happening here? Or look at all the other princesses. What do you notice about them? Do you think anyone can be a princess? Do they have to have a certain skin color or look a certain way? And it's usually good to sort of stop along the way, pause 2 or 3 times strategically, and bring up this conversation. Kids, just like adults, don't just respond to words. So this isn't just quote unquote talking to your kids about race. This is actually experiential learning that we need to do. I remember taking a class to the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was assassinated. And when young people see that, that impacts them. And then we can use that experience, that hands-on, visceral encounter with race and racism, to have a much more substantive conversation, and it feels different. And you can do that in your own local city. There are historical markers, those signs you pass all the time and never read. Stop and read them one day. See what they say, see what happened there, see if you recognize the names, or if you don't, go and look them up. Utilize all the resources around you and make sure that you're not just talking to your kids about race and diversity and justice, but you're showing them why it's important. Racism is detrimental to the entire society, no matter if you're Black or white, Latino, Asian, Native, whomever. Everyone is impacted, and that's why we need to raise a generation of people that's going to turn around and try to change that momentum toward the tide of anti-racism and racial justice.
All right. Yeah, I love that, because it's just a quick summary, a quick overview of what we've discussed, and also kind of reaffirming that it's not a one and done. It's an experiential experience. It's experiential learning, and my apologies. My the YouTube video was still going. So yes, I think what I really wanted you all to leave with is not feeling the sense of overwhelm, but an awareness, right? Of knowing how your child thinks and how they're understanding the world, knowing that, and then being able to consciously begin to consider, how am I able to remove that stigma from talking about race and speak about it openly in a way that's age appropriate, and also honest and true. And if you ever find yourself getting stumped, I would revisit one of those opening questions, all of the opening questions, honestly, that we covered in our meditation, which is, I feel confident in parenting because, what are those like strengths that you kind of lean on that give you confidence? How can you rely on them more? Or thinking about the first time that you became aware of your race, or thinking about the things that you wish you had or you did have in that pre-encounter stage when you were just kind of stepping into the sense of your racial identity as a child in that pre-encounter and pre-operational stage. And so I hope this has been just the beginning of what is a lifelong journey of what parenting as a Black feminist really means. And in our next couple of sessions, we'll revisit this and continue to build on the knowledge that we've created here. So thank you everyone so much for joining. I'm always so happy to talk about the things that I spent a lot of my academic career studying and learning about. It can be tricky communicating in a way that feels not jargon heavy and not completely lost in the weeds. And so I hope you've been able to pick up on that. And with that, I'll just say thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your week. Thank you again.